in the New York area, and all were on maximum alert, many swamped with casualties. Injuries ranging from shock and asthma attacks brought on by that dust through to broken bones and severe head injuries. And then there were the burns. Hundreds of people burned from head to toe, said one doctor. Here, another on what he saw.
There was one, a burn patient. I mean, it's very difficult to see burn patients. They're charred. They're charred. Their skin is coming off. They're in tremendous pain, and it's tremendous suffering.
Officials were worried about blood supplies, but as soon as that became known, hundreds of New Yorkers lined up to donate, as did Americans across the country, jamming donation centres. Disaster relief agencies working with the military to transport thousands of pints of blood to New York City and to Washington, where survivors of the Pentagon attack were also in need. Among the dead and injured in New York, hundreds of firefighters, rescue workers, police officers, people who'd gone to the scene after the first plane crashed into the Twin Towers to help the injured and evacuate the survivors. They were inside when the buildings collapsed. And at last count, more than half of the 400 firefighters who went to the scene never reported back. Michael Holmes, CNN.
Assuming they got any sleep overnight, Americans will be waking up this day to headlines that will probably still seem very unreal. In some ways, this might be seen as the day the 21st century really began for the American people. Back now to New York, and once again, our Garrick Utley.
Well, really, it's talking or speaking of headlines, we've just got the first edition of one New York newspaper. It's the New York Post. As you can see here, act of war is on the front page. Get it right there. World Trade Center bombed, and there's a picture, a still photo of that one plane heading into one of the World Trade Center towers. We're still waiting for the New York Daily News and the New York Times. They're having trouble getting their papers in, as the Post did, from across the rivers where the printing plants are located, because the bridges and the tunnels have been closed. Today we see many of these images, and yet things that were not captured on videotape can also be very telling and very important. For example, early this evening I experienced two or three things. The skies were quiet over Manhattan after the explosions occurred, because air traffic, of course, had been grounded. Until about 7 o'clock this evening, and suddenly I was outside and I heard a noise, a strange noise. It was a U.S. Air Force fighter plane flying over Manhattan. One fighter, rather high, streaking across this city. Never heard that before here. A few minutes later, trying to get transportation. There are no taxis in town, very few buses or subways running. At the edge of Central Park, where tourists love to come, there was one of those horse-drawn carriages, the hansom cabs. Just one, a horse, the carriage, and its rider, its driver, looking for fares, alone in an empty street at Central Park South. But there were no customers out on the streets this evening. Finally, you find a bus, get on a New York City bus, and guess what? No charge. Everybody rides free these days and these nights in Manhattan. Those are some of the little things that aren't recorded on videotape, and here now are some of the pictures we've really been seeing over these past several hours. Let's go to them once again. We saw this extraordinary sight, the Exodus. We really can't call it anything more than that. People leaving Manhattan this afternoon. Maybe you've seen these scenes before. In lower Manhattan, the Brooklyn Bridge, famous to so many people. Just look at that. And look how orderly everyone is. Concern, anxiety, certainly, but order. No panic here. Amazing in view of what had just happened a few minutes before, after the planes struck the building. It comes down. Only 31 years old, the World Trade Center towers, and down they came. Down they came after the fire in the towers reached 1,500 or 1,600 degrees or even more. That melted the steel. As it melted the steel, shell or frame, the floors collapsed, each on the other, and down they came into rubble. And amid this, the chaos, understandable chaos, confusion, fear, fleeing, the pure, basic human instinct of self-preservation. And yet, even in these scenes, again and again, the reports of how many individuals helped each other, helped pull them along, their friends, their colleagues. And tonight, the rescue efforts continue. Heavy machinery as well as floodlights, runoff portable generators have been brought in. There are up to 10,000 rescue workers in Manhattan, working day and night. Still no estimates as to what the casualties will be in the World Trade Center bombings. But the work continues. It has only begun. Which also raises another question, a question that New Yorkers will be asking as they get up this morning, and perhaps people across the nation will be asking too. Was this it? Is it now over? As horrendous as it was the taking down of the two towers here, the bombing of the Pentagon, the bombing of the plane that crashed in Pennsylvania, is that the end of this terrorist attack by whomever organized it? Or could there be more attacks? We don't know. We don't want to raise any undue concern. But the fact that New York City security officials and federal officials, security officials, are saying keep the bridges and the tunnels closed tomorrow, keep the airports closed, keep the planes grounded, means they are obviously very concerned that there may still be another attack out there, some terrorist out there. Earlier this evening, bomb squads could be seen racing through the city, checking out every suspicious vehicle. They don't know, the security people, we don't know. And of course, we'll never know until it happens again if it does. Ralitza?
Garrick, certainly there is a massive loss of a sense of security that Americans will have after this event.
Certainly, there's no question about this. This is, as has been said many times today, the single most traumatic direct attack on American territory and lives since December 7th, 1941. And this, too, will be a day that will last much.
For us, even here, it's just still starting to sink in. All the planes are now grounded across America. When they come back on tomorrow, hopefully tomorrow, we're getting the first plane out of here. We're getting the first Qantas flight to LA and then back to Sydney.
Well, you can understand why he's leaving. No one is sure what will happen next. One thing is for certain, however, the United States will strike back. People are demanding revenge, and Gulf War Commander-in-Chief General Norman Schwarzkopf says America will respond.
No terrorist operation can survive without a support base. There's no doubt in my mind that there's some place within our country right now, there's some people who supported those terrorists prior to the time they went and got in those airplanes. And those are the people, too, that you have to find. It's an awful big world out there and an awful lot of places to hide, and you got to know exactly where they are before you're going to be able to hit them. So that's a really, really tough intelligence problem. We've got some outstanding military units out there that are fully prepared to take on the terrorists on the ground in any kind of fighting they want to fight the battle. Yeah, there's an awful lot of technology involved in the business of war fighting, but there's an awful lot of the warrior spirit that's involved too. And we've got special operations forces, we've got ranger forces, we've got special operations forces in all of our services that are very, very capable of taking on the terrorists, by their rules or ours. So once we find them, we'll be ready to deal with them. There's absolutely no question in my mind about that. In the Gulf War, some of the people today criticize what we did in Iraq. We went to extraordinary ends in the Gulf War, even endangering our own forces more so to avoid attacking innocent civilians. And yet what these bastards have done is deliberately attacked innocent civilians, and that's the difference between them and us.
So who committed this evil and despicable act? Well, by all accounts, the finger of blame is being pointed at Osama bin Laden, the Saudi billionaire who's declared a holy war on the United States and is believed to be hiding in Afghanistan. And bin Laden is just one of a number of terrorists the United States has vowed to track down. Chris Simmons reports.
I've directed the full resources of our intelligence and law enforcement communities to find those responsible and to bring them to justice. We will make no distinction between the terrorists who committed these acts and those who harbor them.
Tonight, this is the most wanted man in the world. Osama bin Laden, the Saudi Arabian dissident, last seen in January at his son's wedding in Afghanistan. He's believed to be the terrorist leader behind the hijacking of the 3 airliners forced to become guided missiles. flying into the Twin Towers of the World Trade Center in New York and Washington's military nerve center, the Pentagon, paralyzing the United States, indeed the world. Crushed the United States, he said recently, while pledging his escalation of the holy war against America. It was his commitment to avenge 4 of his followers held in New York, awaiting sentencing for bomb attacks against America. Considered a most serious and immediate threat to the United States, billionaire bin Laden came to prominence in the 1980s, fighting the Soviet occupation of Afghanistan. Since then, he's been linked to a series of global terrorist attacks, starting with the bombing of New York's World Trade Center in 1993, leaving 6 dead and more than 1,000 injured. Then, in 1998, it was the simultaneous bombing of American embassies in Kenya and Tanzania, killing 224. The most recent, last year's suicide bomb attack on the USS Cole, in which 17 servicemen died. He used this home video to brag about the killings and to recruit more terrorists.
He alone, probably within the Islamic world, has amassed and developed a terrorist network, an international network, which would be capable of carrying out such an atrocity.
With bin Laden claiming all Americans as legitimate targets, he and his bodyguards move as many as 3 times a day to remain one step ahead of any retaliation. After the US embassy bombings, America had responded with missile strikes on bin Laden's headquarters, but the world's most feared man had already fled and remains in hiding. After this latest attack, Afghanistan's ruling Taliban militia distanced themselves from bin Laden, denying he was involved. Expert opinion differs.
He's targeted the US because he sees America as the head of the snake, as he calls it. The body of the snake is the corrupt governments in the Middle East that he has promised to overthrow, and also Israel.
The most frightening aspect of this latest horror attack is that bin Laden's worldwide popularity is growing by the day. An estimated 25,000 of his followers around the globe are reportedly readying themselves for an all-out holy war against America. But as most of the world mourned the massive loss of life, it brought celebration in some quarters. Palestinians have been rejoicing in the streets, claiming America had it coming to them. Their leader, Yasser Arafat, was not in accord.
We are completely shocked. Completely shocked. Unbelievable.
None of us will ever forget this day. Yet we go forward to defend freedom and all that is good and just in our world. Thank you. Good night, and God bless America.
Well, as the hunt for the terrorists continues, another remarkable story of survival. Renata Sihelk is a young Perth woman who is working in the World Trade Center when the first plane crashed into the tower next door. Terrified, she rushed down 44 flights of stairs, and moments later the second hijacked plane crashed into her office. And Nadine Cassidy made contact with Renata by phone a short time ago.
I literally just walked in the building onto my floor, which is in Tower 2, when I heard a rumble just above my head. I was on floor 67, and within 10 seconds or so, a man ran from the north side of the building towards me and said, "Get out of the building, I've just seen a plane hit the building." And within a matter of seconds, there was a group of probably 10 to 12 of us, and we just ran for the elevator.
Renata Sihelk is incredibly lucky. 12 hours after America's horrific terrorist attacks, this Perth woman is alive to tell her amazing story.
And when you actually got into the elevator with this man, had he told you what he'd seen?
Yeah, he said. He literally was very quiet. And, I mean, the lift was very quiet and people just sort of looking at each other nervously. And I said to him, I said, "Did you say a plane hit the building? Like, what kind of plane?" And he said it was an American Airlines jet.
The FBI says this was a United Airlines flight, 175 out of Boston, also headed to Los Angeles.
We ran onto level 44, which is like this main commuter lobby area where all the large lifts end up, and ran for the nearest stairwell. And I know that on level 44, it was just a really strange scene. I mean, there wasn't an alarm as such. People obviously thought there was something wrong, but there wasn't any sort of indication of what was going to happen and what had taken place. It was just very surreal, very quiet almost, and I looked up and it wasn't my building that was on fire, it was the one behind it, which had first been hit, because I wasn't sure when the man said the building has been hit by a plane, I thought he was referring to our building. And as I stood there, looking up, our building exploded, and at that point I just ran. As soon as I ran for cover, obviously I ran a few blocks away and people just standing around, and obviously the story started to emerge. I saw the plane, there were 2 planes, and just no one really knew what was happening. I mean, clearly it was a terrorist attack.
And Renata, when you were down on 40 metres away from your building and you saw it explode, obviously you could see that your level was part of that. I mean, what was the feeling then? Oh, just absolute disbelief. I mean, it was like a movie. I've never been in that situation. You can't imagine yourself as ever being in that situation. And just, looking up at it and just seeing it explode. Even then it was like, whoa. I mean, what was that? I was just absolutely horrified. I've since heard that people were jumping from the 80th floor, 90th floor, knowing how those buildings are built. I mean, if you were caught above it, you would never have made it out. It was just, I cannot begin to explain to you the mood of this city. It is absolute disbelief and absolute sorrow.
The attack happened a world away, but it has worldwide repercussions, and if terrorists can strike at the heart of America, people are wondering if it could happen here. Richard Forbes reports.
Yeah, there is that chance, I suppose. Could always happen.
Brings it pretty close to home, doesn't it?
It does. Brings it very close to home.
Are you guys worried that something like this could happen here in Australia?
Oh, most definitely.
Anywhere in the world. Anywhere. It can happen anywhere.
Australians have always felt a long way away from terrorism and the events that have gripped the world over the past 24 hours. But all that's changed.
At the request of the Federal Department of Transport and Regional Services, all Australian airports have been asked to heighten security.
All major Australian airports are now on full alert. Bianca Polidori from Melbourne Airport.
To give you some idea, the increased security measures put in place for this instance are similar to those that were put in place for Desert Storm. So they're systems that have been used before. This will include increased police presence and increased vigilance both airside and landside.
So how safe are we, despite being so geographically isolated?
Could it happen here in Australia?
It could happen probably anywhere, but it's unlikely to happen here in Australia because we don't have the prime targets that the United States has.
Ian Haig was Australian ambassador in Saudi Arabia and the Gulf for 3 years and has spent 15 years in the Middle East.
Should we be concerned at all?
Of course we should. No country should be unconcerned any further. Catastrophes of this sort simply can't be borne by any country. We must be concerned, and we must make sure that we do everything we can to prevent this sort of occurrence happening in Australia, or for that matter anywhere else.
How do we protect ourselves? What is our security like?
The only thing you can do to protect yourself is make it harder for them to get at you than at other people. And that means being very vigilant in terms of security. In Australia, we're certainly going to have a look at flights and how you control them.
If people can get into their domestic system, how easy is it to get into ours?
At the moment, I would think reasonably easy, but it would be not too difficult to make it pretty difficult.
This is something that no one escapes from. Everyone has an impact about this, even if we don't know people directly involved.
Dr. David List is a clinical psychologist who grew up in New York. He believes Australia can't afford to be complacent after a tragedy of this magnitude.
This is a picture of Mark Bingham, who made a phone call from one of the hijacked planes to his relatives.
And he said, "Hi, Mom, this is Mark Bingham." Giving me his last name. And he said, "I want to let you know that I love you."
There is a lot of confusion here at the Pentagon. It appears that something hit
the Pentagon on the outside of the 5th corridor, on the Army corridor. Several Army officers I talked to reported hearing a big explosion, seeing shards of metal coming past their window. The Pentagon has been evacuated. Emergency services personnel were rushing to reports of several people trapped in the building. Most of the building's 24,000 people are outside of the building or in the center courtyard.
The White House is reporting that the Capitol building has been evacuated and the Treasury Department has been evacuated. Washington, D.C., the nation's capital, is exceptionally tense and clearly taking steps as if it is virtually under siege here.
There has just been a huge explosion. We can see a billowing smoke rising, and I'll tell you that I can't see that second tower, but there was a cascade of sparks and fire, and now it looks almost like a mushroom cloud explosion, this huge billowing smoke in the second tower.
I hope I live. I hope I live. It's coming down on me. Here it comes. I'm getting behind a car. It's incredible. Okay, I'm gonna have to go find people who need help, because I don't think I'm one of them. You okay, sir? Okay. Can I just get a toot off your respirator? Yeah. Can I get a toot? I'm seeing a couple of clean breaths. That's good. Okay. Back to you. This is the car I hid behind. It saved my life. Oh, wait, maybe it was this one. There's all these noises. I don't know what it is. They say someone needs help.
Yeah, Mike! Mike! Mike, come over here! Yeah!
Anybody need a doctor?
Where are you?
Don't have oxygen.
Hello, Doc.
Hey, that guy needs some oxygen if someone can share it with him.
10-4.
Thanks. They told me just to wait here at this semi-staging area. See if I can help, so that's what I'm doing. They won't let me go any closer. No one fireman can go in to get the people out. There's small explosions still going on. So far, I've just seen some people who needed oxygen from the dust. That was one trauma. Gonna go wash my eyes out. Did we just heard another explosion? They're handing out gloves and masks.
Freedom itself was attacked this morning by a faceless coward.
Stay tuned to ABC News and Current Affairs for all the latest on the terrorist attack in the heart of America.
On the 82nd floor, and I don't know where my peers are.
Wherever you are, ABC keeps you in the picture, delivering the latest news all day, television, radio and online.
Move it! Come on! I must have counted like 30 or 40 people, you know.
ABC News and Current Affairs keeps you in touch.
Find out who made it out okay and account for the people that may not have made it out.
On Sky News.
Terrorist atrocity. Extremists strike at the heart of the United States. Thousands feared dead as rescue teams search the rubble for survivors. Justice promised. President Bush vows to find those responsible. And one other important story today, the future of Ansett, after Qantas says no to buyout.
Sky News. On the Hour with John Mangos.
Good evening to you. It's being described as the world's worst terrorist atrocity, and there are now fears the death toll could stretch into the tens of thousands. These are the latest major developments now from the United States. The Australian Foreign Affairs Department issues a warning about travel to America. Emergency services are working through the night to rescue survivors and retrieve the bodies of the dead. 50 Australians now unaccounted for. 300 New York firefighters also missing. And New York's mayor has warned against vengeance attacks.
America was under attack. New York was the front line, and the World Trade Center, famous twin symbol of American prosperity, was on fire. At 8:45 in the morning, a Boeing 767 speared deep inside the North Tower. It was already crowded with some of the 50,000 people who worked at the complex. 19 minutes later, it became brutally clear this was no accident. The incredible sight of the second passenger jet heading straight into the second tower, setting off a huge explosion.
Boom! Oh, man. What's going on?
From far below, another cameraman recorded the scene as a man sat unaware of what was happening. The jet was swallowed by the building, then almost emerged on the far side. The most audacious terrorist attack in history was fully underway.
It's got to be a terrorist attack. I can't tell you anything more than that. I saw the plane hit the building.
By now, the world was watching as flames took hold. But even then, few expected this was about to become worse, much, much worse. Trapped by flames and smoke, dozens of people hung out from the broken windows, trying to attract help, but many others realised rescue was impossible.
One at a time from different parts of the building. I just started seeing people just drop. And I must have counted like 30 or 40 people, you know.
For all those who somehow kept hope alive and thousands more scrambling to escape down the stairwell, all hope ran out.
Oh my God. We gotta go.
In a horrifying, peeling cascade, all 110 floors of the South Tower came thundering to earth. A doctor recorded the scenes on his camera.
I hope I live. I hope I live. It's coming down on me. Here it comes. I'm getting behind a car. It's incredible. Okay, I'm gonna have to go find people who need help. Because I don't think I'm one of them.
Dude, man, the goddamn's gone. It blew up. I don't know. I came down. I'm alive.
Still around, guys. Still around.
Another cameraman kept recording as a massive dust cloud rolled towards him. Then the shockwave knocking other people to the ground. Everywhere, people running. This reporter telling how a stranger tried to save her from the blast.
Finally, as we ran and ran, he slammed me into a wall and covered my body with his. I could feel his heart beating against my backbone. And I think both of us were sure we were dead.
And then the North Tower, also shaken to its very foundations, could stand no more.
The second one is going down now, as I speak live. The second one is now collapsed down to the ground.
I'm asking you for your life. Get the out of here, please. Let's go. All right, we got so many people dead. Let's go, please, out of here. I saw it blow and then ran like hell. Thank God. I'm 69, but I can still run. This is now the terrible task at hand, emerging from the dirt and rubble and smoke. The fleets of ambulances, presumably carrying the many, many dead.
Any way possible, rescuers rushed to help. Any transport they could find used to get the injured to hospital. One conservative estimate has up to 2,000 people admitted to hospital, mostly with burns and breathing problems. Also turning up, people answering the appeal to give blood on a scale not seen outside wartime. With both towers gone from the New York skyline, their rubble filled the streets for blocks around the scene. Also on the ground, an engine from one of the jets. Fire engines and other emergency vehicles were pounded by the wreckage. Up to 300 police, firemen and paramedics are thought to be among the dead.
I'm some of the best people in this department. I can't find anybody from 5 rescues and 7 squads, and it's just, it's a devastating thing.
Did you see people bleeding, and what did you see?
Oh, everybody could see. You want blood? Here's blood. Everybody's bleeding.
Nightmares. Armageddon right here.
Overshadowed by all this, another outrage an hour later in Washington. A third hijacked passenger jet aimed at the heart of America's military, the Pentagon. The aircraft crashed right through to the central courtyard, killing all 64 on board. 20,000 people work at the Pentagon, and the death toll on the ground is said to be at least 800. Fearing the White House was another target, the Secret Service evacuated all staff except for the government executive and military high command bunkered below the building. A fourth and final hijacked passenger jet remained a menace in the sky, apparently unable to reach its target of the Camp David presidential retreat. It crashed in woodlands in Pennsylvania. There were no survivors. Another 45 innocent passengers and crew taken to their deaths. Back in New York, the tragic sight of a mortally wounded city, but Lady Liberty's standing strong. America will be leaning heavily on her symbols of nationhood, comforting the bereaved, tending the wounded, and looking for justice against such ruthless invaders.
The death toll from this tragedy still is anyone's guess. Many thousands were in the World Trade Center. About 300 firemen, another 100 police are missing after going in to help. Up to 800 could have died in the Pentagon, and at least 200 were on the hijacked planes. Americans are understandably in a state of shock, and President Bush has promised the people responsible will be hunted down and punished.
Americans truly believe that today someone, some group, declared war on them. As they watched the horror of it all unfold before them on television, the country went on a warlike footing.
The worst part about it is there ain't nobody to fight.
With the World Trade Center burning in New York, the Pentagon partly destroyed in the nation's capital, the White House was thought to be the next likely target.
Move everybody across the street.
The president was out of town in Florida, so everyone, except the vice president and his national security team, were told to get out.
I'm told that a plane went into the Pentagon and they're chasing us off the grounds here.
The vice president then headed for a bomb-proof bunker to coordinate a response to the crisis.
Everybody back.
With the continuing threat in Washington, the Secret Service ordered President Bush to stay away from the city. A meeting with school children in Florida was abruptly interrupted, and he was soon trying to reassure a shocked nation.
Freedom itself was attacked this morning by a faceless coward, and freedom will be defended.
President Bush was eventually given the all-clear to return to Washington in the late afternoon. His plane shadowed all the way by a group of fighter planes. Soon after, an obviously shocked president appeared on the nation's TV screens.
The pictures of airplanes flying into buildings, fires burning, huge structures collapsing, have filled us with disbelief, terrible sadness, and a quiet, unyielding anger.
He described the death toll as in the thousands and issued a warning to those responsible for the attacks.
I've directed the full resources of our intelligence and law enforcement communities to find those responsible and to bring them to justice. We will make no distinction between the terrorists who committed these acts and those who harbored them.
Government buildings all over America have been closed and workers told to stay away until the FBI gives the all clear. Because this attack was so well planned, so secretive, there's no guarantee that the mayhem we've seen today is the end of it. And for the first time in the nation's history, all airports across America were immediately closed. There will be another few hours before any decision is made about when planes will fly again.
The airport's being evacuated. They need to go home.
The World Trade Center was seen as the ultimate symbol of America's economic power. Situated close to the world's best-known financial district, Wall Street, there are real fears now about what might happen when the stock market eventually reopens and what effect all this might have on an already shaky US economy.
This is a very serious event. It's economic shocks that come out of the blue that ultimately send us into economic recessions, and this certainly qualifies as a shock of immense proportion.
In another security procedure never before witnessed, senior political leaders were helicoptered to a secret location, while other politicians and their staffs were told to get away from the Capitol building, while fighter planes patrolled overhead. And then police closed off the city of Washington to outsiders. A sense of quiet rage settled over the national capital.
Let's get away from the building, ladies and gentlemen.
It was a feeling echoed across America. It's people now worried about the future, with so many asking, how could this have happened?
I hope they're sending planes over there right now. Take care of business.
Military leaders were brought out as well to do their best to reassure a shell-shocked nation.
But make no mistake about it, your armed forces are ready.
At airports where those hijacked planes were due to land, tragic scenes as emotional relatives realised their loved ones would not be arriving. And finally, in a move to unify a stunned population, a group of politicians from all sides gathered on the steps of Washington's Capitol building tonight. They were there to show their resolve on this, the worst of days.
God bless America, my home, sweet home.
They're used to European tussles at Ibrox, but not with the authorities. 2 days.
It's immense tragedy. The Red Cross is emphasizing recovery. We must recover. We have to pick up and move on with our lives and begin to deal with this whole tragedy that has affected all of America. And that involves a lot of mental health assistance. It's okay to talk about the tragedy. It's okay to talk to your children. And Red Cross trained mental health workers, licensed psychologists and psychiatrists are on the ground in New York and in Washington, D.C. and in Pennsylvania, as well as everywhere across the country to help save lives every day, and especially today as we recover from this tragedy.
Shelley, you just said recovery. Don't you mean rescue? Isn't the Red Cross still holding out hope that there are some people who are trapped inside the rubble?
Absolutely. It's just wonderful that we know that there are people who are still alive, and we know that there is rescue possible. In the meantime, families are worried about their loved ones. They don't know what's happened to their loved ones. They're wondering what's happening in New York and D.C. and Pennsylvania. And we want to make sure that those families, in addition to the rescue workers who have been working around the clock, all have the support that they need. And they will get that from the American Red Cross, that symbol of help.
And is there anything that could be in your training that could prepare you for this particular incident when people are trapped in a building at this magnitude, when we have an unprecedented disaster? Are you in uncharted waters in any respect?
The American Red Cross, all volunteers, have a lot of training, but I tell you what, there is nothing like this that has ever happened before. It is really an unprecedented event for all of our country.
Shelley, let's figure out exactly how people can help the American Red Cross right now. To give blood, what do they do?
Call 1-800-GIVE-LIFE, make an appointment, and keep that appointment.
Alrighty, and we also know that many people are going to be hit financially.
Former security chief at TWA, and he joins us from London this morning. Good morning, Mr. Baum.
Good morning to you.
Sir, this is the question that many Americans are asking right now. How could this happen? How could 4 commercial airliners be hijacked in the morning? And it's just beyond belief. How did it happen?
Absolutely, it is an absolute tragedy, the real nightmare scenario for the aviation security industry and, of course, for the American people and the world as a whole. The only thing that could have been worse would have been if it had been a chemical or biological attack on one of these cities. It would appear that the real failing has been on the intelligence side in preventing these incidents. In the past, intelligence has worked. You only have to go back to 1995 when American intelligence basically thwarted, in what was known as the Bojinga plot, the blowing up of 12 American airliners on one single day. That day, American intelligence worked. September the 11th, 2001, unfortunately, it all fell apart. And what the pictures that we've all been witnessing are those of really of a war scene. You could have been seeing those pictures of the Balkans or of the Middle East, and yet this was downtown Manhattan, downtown Washington. And that just sort of reminds me of...
Excuse me, Mr. Baum, you talked about the overall picture and intelligence, but what about the basics of airport security? And that is, these people commandeering a plane. Would we be shocked at how easily that can be done and how easily it might have been done yesterday?
I'd love to say that I was shocked. Truth is, I wasn't. I was shocked by the outcome and the fact that probably at least 12 people could have decided to go to their deaths in such a tragic manner and killing so many other innocent people in the process. Yes, airport security procedures are going to have to be reviewed, especially domestically in the United States. I don't think it's a surprise that they targeted American Airlines and United Airlines, basically the two giants of the aviation industry. It used to be Pan Am and TWA. It's no surprise that they targeted flights that were going to the West Coast, to San Francisco and Los Angeles, so that on impact, those planes would have been carrying far more fuel than any other aircraft in the sky, so the impact would have been that much greater. But certainly domestic aviation security is going to have to be reviewed. But that said, it's not such an easy thing to do. In Europe, we have a situation where only the passengers can go to the gates. In the United States, as many of your viewers will be well aware, anybody meeting or greeting passengers can go through the security checkpoints and up to the gates, meaning that there's an increased stress on the screeners.
Mr. Baum, maybe as a security expert, you can tell us exactly what pilots and flight attendants are instructed to do in case of an emergency, in case of a hijacking. What are their immediate instructions, or procedurally?
Well, the procedures, unlike mechanical failures, are basically to evaluate the type of hijacker. There are 4 different types of hijackers. There are criminals, there are terrorists, there are asylum seekers, and there are the insane or the mentally disturbed. This may be a combination of different types, but you have to react to the type of hijacker you have. Now, if, as we're led to believe, that these were very violent people who simply got out of their seats and started slashing flight attendants, then there is only so much that one can do, and one would have expected them to have just sort of gone back to their natural survival instincts and done whatever they could possibly do to survive. What I do not believe was the case.
Go ahead, sir. Excuse me. Go ahead.
Sorry, I certainly don't believe that it was the pilots themselves, even at knife point or gunpoint, that would have intentionally flown their aircraft into the Twin Towers or into the Pentagon.
You mentioned this briefly, you touched on this, but what will this mean for the future, security-wise, for commercial airlines? What can you see maybe immediately and through the first few months after this situation?
Well, certainly, I mean, there's already been an increase to threat code Delta in the United States, so security is basically at its highest level of alert once the planes go back in the skies. But that said, so there won't be things like curbside check-in. There will be restricting access to the gate areas. But I think that it's possibly taken an incident like this to prove that domestic security has to be treated the same way as international security on international flights. In other words, that there needs to be positive passenger bag match, that if you check a bag in for a flight, that you travel on that flight, that only passengers go to the gate areas, and certainly that the identification checks that are carried out by the check-in agents are going to be much more stringent. That said, I don't think we need to focus solely on screening of passengers. This was a very well orchestrated attack. This involved insiders, either in the airlines or in the airports. Certainly there are reports coming through this morning from Boston of people with contacts in the UAE with flight manuals were found in a car in Boston. These people knew what they were doing. They probably had very good contacts, and they didn't necessarily go through the passenger screening points.
All right, Philip Baum, thank you very much for joining us this morning.
Vince, as dawn begins to break over the East Coast, we take you now live for what for many of you could be the first look here on this day after of this devastating terrorist attack. The gap in the sky where you are looking is where the Twin Towers of the World Trade Center once stood. The New York skyline completely changed this morning as hundreds of firefighters are going through the rubble, trying to find if there are any survivors, trying to count the dead. We may not know for weeks how many people died in this attack on one of America's most significant financial power centers. And then on to Washington now, where we have this devastating scene of the Pentagon. There you see the collapsed area of the building where a passenger jet plowed through to the inner circle of the Pentagon. Once again, rescue operations there underway. As many as 800 or more Pentagon employees may have died in this attack. We are covering this throughout the day, but in the meantime, of course, Garrett Utley on the scene in New York, reviewing the damage, counting the losses. Garrett?
And Carol, also at this moment, we want to take a few moments and think about some of the heroes in today's tragedy or yesterday's tragedy. Of course, we don't know how many they were and what was happening in that airplane that crashed in Pennsylvania or in the Pentagon offices or even here in Lower Manhattan. But we do know this. We do know that 80 or more members of the New York City Police Department, men and women, are missing and feared lost. We know that 300 or perhaps even more members of the New York City Fire Department are missing or lost. Who were they? They were people doing their jobs. They were the ones this morning or yesterday morning who were racing into those Twin Towers to save people, going up the stairwells while everybody else was racing out, and they raced into a trap. Here's a report from correspondent Deborah Farrick.
Many of the 300 firefighters missing and feared dead were believed to be inside the World Trade Center when it collapsed.
When I can't find anybody from 5 rescues and 7 squads, and it's just, it's a devastating thing. I don't know, well, the fire department will recover, but I don't know how.
Arriving first on scene, they ran into the burning towers, carrying hoses and trying to get people to safety.
The horror of it all was all the first alarm, second alarm, third alarm, fifth alarm companies. They were all in there. And there's a lot of companies that wiped out from what I understand.
Fire engines were crushed, a strategic command center silenced, and several of the highest-ranking fire officials buried beneath tons of dust and steel.
I don't know what to say. We lost people that have given over 40 years.
Those who got out in time went back, injuries and all, to search for their friends. Others off duty grabbed their gear and raced to help dig out any possible survivors.
My brother works in the 91st floor. My brother, and he's unaccounted for at this time. So I'm just, doing a lot of praying.
Praying amidst an unnatural silence.
That's probably what amazed me the most. There was no people to be seen. Even the dogs couldn't find people.
At firehouses in Manhattan, there were flowers and mourning as everyone waited, holding out hope.
They should have been here already. The rig is not back. They're not back. They should have been back.
More than 30 police officers also died. Choking back tears, several firefighters summed up the catastrophe.
These are your buddies.
We lost a lot of friends today. A lot of friends.
A loss that will be shared by all New Yorkers. Deborah Farrick, CNN, New York.
And now we have some of the names of the 4 most high-ranking members of the New York City Fire Department. We'd like to mention them to you because we're getting so few names of.
America was targeted for attack because we're the brightest beacon for freedom and opportunity in the world. And no one will keep that light from shining. Today, our nation saw evil, the very worst of human nature. And we responded with the best of America, with the daring of our rescue workers, with the caring for strangers and neighbors who came to give blood and help in any way they could. The search is underway for those who are behind these evil acts. I've directed the full resources of our intelligence and law enforcement communities to find those responsible and to bring them to justice. We will make no distinction between the terrorists who committed these acts and those who harbor them. America has stood down enemies before, and we will do so this time. None of us will ever forget this day, yet we go forward to defend freedom and all that is good and just in our world. Thank you, good night, and God bless America.
George Bush speaking earlier today to the American people. We won't know the final toll of dead and injured for days, but it's clear it will run into many thousands. Many more than died at Pearl Harbor, possibly more than were killed and wounded in any single battle of America's bloody Civil War. The Bush administration and the entire nation will now be asking how the richest and most sophisticated society on earth could prove so vulnerable. Why did its massive security apparatus apparently fail to pick up any warnings? I talked earlier today to counter-terrorism expert Dr. Neil Livingston in Washington. Neil Livingston, what light can you shed on what it would have taken to put these attacks together and carry them out?
Well, this has been our worst nightmare for many years, and that is a coordinated series of attacks against high-consequence targets in this country. It wasn't a question of if it would happen, it was only a question of when it would happen. And so as a consequence, we've given this a lot of thought in the past, and we know that it would take a great deal of money, logistics capability, reasonable intelligence, excellent coordination. And so there are only a few terrorist groups in the world that could mount that kind of attack, and perhaps a couple of countries.
Who are the obvious suspects?
Well, all of the prime suspects, according to our friends in the law enforcement and intelligence community right now, are in the Middle East. And Osama bin Laden certainly heads the list of suspects in terms of terrorist groups and organizations, but also some concern about some Palestinian groups and groups like Hamas and Islamic Jihad, but all Islamicist type of groups. On the other side of the equation, on state sponsors, it has not gone unnoticed, of course, that 10 years ago the United States was engaged in what was the run-up to a conflict with Saddam Hussein. And that was George W. Bush's father. And so there has always been a sense that Iraq would pick its time and place and at some point might strike back at us.
The connection between these attacks and the sentencing today of the original bomber of the World Trade Center seems unavoidable.
Well, there certainly is coincidence at the very least in that regard, and it may have been marked. But I would say that the terrorists may have not picked this day especially, but rather this time period.
In other words, these attacks might originally have been intended even for another day.
Absolutely, and been prepared to do it tomorrow if they couldn't do it today.
What does this say about America's capacity to defend itself against this type of attack?
Our airport security is not as good as it should be. We have the only airport security system in the world that a major country has that is not totally federalized. It is the responsibility in many cases of the airlines themselves and of the local airport authorities. And that's a system that's broken and needs to be fixed.
How likely is it that there are other targets?
What we're concerned about right now is that there may be a B team, a C team, a D team, either preparing in some other part of the world for terrorist strikes tomorrow or the next day or next week, or against other cities in the United States.
How on earth does America or any other country prepare for that?
Well, I think that right now it's going to take a coordinated effort by all of the like-minded countries to take the appropriate steps to essentially destroy the terrorists and their state sponsors. This is war. It won't end until one side is totally defeated, and I don't think that's going to be the United States.
We're talking about 4 planes hijacked, even the Pentagon itself attacked. This has to represent a gross failure of US intelligence, doesn't it?
Well, of course it represents an intelligence failure, but once again, our homeland defense cannot start at our shores. And I would say that this is more a consequence of 25 years of weak policies, political policies against terrorist sponsoring countries and against terrorist organizations.
To what extent will this impact on current American defense priorities? The US right now is gearing up to spend billions and billions and billions on a missile defence system which might not work when we've just seen low-flying commercial airliners strike at the heart of America?
I think what you've seen is the end of missile defense, or certainly a slowing down of that program in favor of homeland defense right now. I think many of the billions that were going to go to the so-called Star Wars program are now going to be diverted by Congress and the public in this country who are going to demand protection here at home.
Given the intensity of public feeling that will flow from this, is there a risk that it will hinder clear thinking in how America responds?
The U.S. is never going to be the same again. This is, it's going to change the way we get on planes in the future. It's going to change the way we view the world and even our security here at home. And it's going to be a vastly changed society if we do not take the steps right now to ensure that we deal with the problem forcefully and effectively. The worst thing that could happen is for many of the American people to think that we did not deal with this problem appropriately.
Neil Livingston, thanks for talking with us.
Thank you.
As the world rethinks the frightening capacity of international terrorism, Queensland's Premier Peter Beattie says he's determined to continue with plans for the Commonwealth Heads of Government meeting in Brisbane in early October. Although some Queenslanders are calling for CHOGM to be abandoned because of the threat of violence in the heart of their capital, Peter Beattie says the meeting must go on in the name of democracy. The Premier joins us now live from Brisbane. Peter Beattie, I suppose the reaction of some people there, some residents there, might be understandable given the images coming out of New York and Washington today. But has there been any suggestion at the official level that there might be a rethink going on about the wisdom of holding CHOGM?
No, Kerry, there hasn't. I think it is understandable that some people would be concerned about these matters, bearing in mind what's happened in the US. But the bottom line here is very simple. If we cancel meetings like CHOGM, where do you stop? What that simply means is that terrorism wins. And we can't allow terrorism to win, because what happens next? Do we cancel the parliaments of Australia, the parliaments of Britain, the parliaments of other countries, the Congress? I mean, if terrorism doesn't see clearly that democracies are prepared to fight and to stand by their institutions, then it's all over. I mean, the fact is, democracies are like a very fragile flower. You've got to give them sunshine. If you hide them away, then that's the beginning of the end. It's that simple. And one of the most important things, Kerry, about democracies is the right of people to meet, particularly elected representatives, to discuss problems and solve them. If you lose that, then you start down that terrible road of an end to democracy.
Have you been in contact with Canberra and, for that matter, the Commonwealth about any extra measures that might need to be taken?
Well, two things. I had a discussion today with John Anderson, the acting Prime Minister, and I assured him of the Queensland Government support for a continuation of the holding of CHOGM here. We had a meeting of the CHOGM organisation, the federal body here, with state police and our state people. Yes, those bodies agreed that it would be business as usual. So the preparation is continuing. And Kerry, let me tell you this, just before I did this interview, I left a meeting of almost 700 volunteers. Those 700 volunteers are people who are volunteering to help at CHOGM. Now, they turned up. No one withdrew today. And as I said to them when I addressed them, I said they are great.
Just on the investigation, as well as the rescue and recovery efforts underway, as well as the diplomatic efforts by the State Department and others to reach out to key allies and other governments around the world for their assessment of this great tragedy. And then the president, very determined, much like we just heard from Garrett Utley in New York, very determined, even as the investigation, even as the rescue operations go underway, to show some sense of continuity, some sense of the government at work. The president will bring major congressional leaders down to the White House later this morning. They will deliver public remarks trying to reassure the American people that as the investigation continues and as the government promises to find out who did this and bring those parties to justice, that the business of the government will go on.
John, when we are threatened, and certainly we've never seen anything like this, but does the White House assemble, for lack of a better term, a usual suspects list? And are we moving any closer to clues as to who might be responsible for this?
Well, certainly the White House has a usual suspect list that begins because of the sophistication of these attacks. 4 planes hijacked at the same time. Obviously, some of the people aboard those planes being able to pilot them the White House saying all signs point to, and we know from briefings given by senior administration officials to key members of Congress, they are saying that they believe that they are collecting credible evidence pointing to associates and affiliates of Osama bin Laden. They also caution us that they want to continue this investigation. And as that plays out, there are always fears. One of the reasons the president did not come directly back to Washington yesterday, there were fears of a follow-up round of attacks. At one point, they had not accounted for all of the planes in the skies over the United States. They did not want the president flying back until they had done so. Remarkable security all day yesterday here in Washington around the president. Air Force One had fighter jets flying in very close proximity to it. And overnight here in Washington, there has been a great debate in recent years about the decision a few years back to close Pennsylvania Avenue to car traffic, whether that was an intrusion on the public's rights to move about here in Washington, to see the sights of the Capitol. Overnight here in the Capitol, Vince, blocks away from the White House, police, Secret Service, even U.S. military Humvee vehicles setting up a perimeter much farther around the White House than we are used to seeing. You can be certain in the days and weeks ahead, security on high alert here in Washington. We're also told throughout the country, especially at airports and train stations and at U.S. embassies and military installations overseas as well.
Yeah, I don't think any question about that. As we look at this and we try to somehow make some semblance of sense of it all, intelligence questions are arising, and Secretary of State Colin Powell said there were, quote, no specific warnings. As the White House and officials try to backtrack a little bit, are they doing that now, trying to see if maybe something was missed, something they could have acted on?
They certainly will do that, and they certainly are doing that. Their primary focus, especially in what they say and what they do in public right now, is on the relief and recovery effort and on the investigation. But make no mistake about it, we heard it throughout the day yesterday from administration officials, as well as especially from key members of Congress, people asking, how could this have happened? How could 4 commercial airliners be hijacked? How could there be no evidence at all that such an attack was being planned? A great number of questions about the efficiency of U.S. intelligence services, a great deal of criticism from key members of Congress yesterday, a great number of promises from key members of Congress to look ahead once we get past the dire days ahead of us as we deal, there you see the picture of the Pentagon, as we deal with repair and recovery, assessing the toll of the casualties and getting on with the investigation. A great number of promises from key members of the Congress to look once again, perhaps all raising the question, are the CIA and other agencies that do this human intelligence, are they underfunded? Are they doing things wrong? How might this have been prevented? Could it have been prevented?
Boy, the questions just continue. Senior correspondent John King, thank you very much.
To get simultaneously to hijack 4 airplanes and to fly them into targets of high value, it's not something he thought about last week, or whoever did this thought about last week. You have to get your people into place. You have to make sure that they know what they're doing. You have to make sure they know what they are going to, what their targets are going to be. You have to plan this meticulously. You have to organize false passports. Now, we understand that the American FBI have identified 5 possible suspects who may well have had passports from the United Arab Emirates. It doesn't mean to say they are Emiratis. It means that they had obtained passports from the United Arab Emirates in the same way as people obtain false passports all over the world. It just would have probably looked good with their complexion. And I think that this is a situation that somebody has thought long and hard about how to do it. The UAE is a strong ally of the United States in the Gulf, so it wouldn't have seemed at all unusual that Emiratis would be traveling domestically in the United States.
Yeah, we'll cut out of London there. I guess who could have done it is one of those critical questions right now. Watching events in the US unfold today has been Scott Burchill, who's a lecturer in international politics at Deakin University in Melbourne. He's an expert in the field of international terrorism, and he joins us right now. Scott, thank you for your time. How do we defend against this kind of attack?
It's impossible. In fact, the cities of New York City and Washington are indefensible against this sort of attack. There's a lot of money and effort is put into airport surveillance and security and checking bombs that have been taken on board aircraft. But there's absolutely nothing that you can do about someone who can hijack a plane and successfully take controls of the plane and fly it into a building.
The Americans have put so much money and so much effort, the CIA and the other counterintelligence operations, yet they were caught by surprise on this one. Why surprise?
Well, it's another failure. They got caught by surprise, apparently, with Iraq's invasion in Kuwait in 1990. They got caught by surprise when the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe collapsed in the late 1980s. And they appear to have missed this one entirely. And given it's a $30 billion investment in an enormous industry, which relies very heavily on satellite surveillance and signals intelligence, it's clear that they're going to have to rethink exactly what their priorities are in this area and redirect funds perhaps in a more successful way.
If Osama bin Laden is the man behind this, is the brains behind it, as he was in Tanzania and Kenya with the bomb blast there, why haven't the Americans been able to take him out?
Well, they've tried and missed him once in Afghanistan, but bin Laden enjoys the patronage of the Taliban regime in Afghanistan. He's someone who obviously takes a great deal of security and checks on his security, so he's clearly not going to spend the same night in the same place twice in a row, and so he's someone clearly who's going to be very elusive and perhaps extremely difficult unless the United States can secure the cooperation of the regime which is currently playing host to him.
Scott, I don't mean it as a silly question, but 007 and Bruce Willis do it comfortably.
That's true, but I think fiction does make things look a lot easier than truth and reality, and this is someone who, remember, is living in a country which protects him, which enables him to conduct his work in relative security. He does it away from the spying eyes of satellites, and he takes his chances. And he got very lucky a couple of years ago when the United States bombed his headquarters and took out some of his security guards and his headquarters in Afghanistan. But he's been lucky, and he's been lucky ever since. But his luck may run out if, of course, it transpires that he was responsible for this.
Just two quick ones. Would you agree that bin Laden is about the only one with the capacity to carry out this sort of attack?
Well, of the terrorist groups from the Middle East and Afghanistan, he seems to be about the only one who could command the resources, the communications, the training and the security and the top secret nature of the planning to pull off something on this sort of epic scale. It's unlikely that any groups within the Palestinian nationalist movement who struggle really to provide terrorism on a much smaller scale could be responsible for something as grand as this.
Okay, and finally then, we have to watch it. We know from the Oklahoma bomb blast there that we don't automatically blame the Middle Eastern terrorists for this. It could be a homegrown one.
It certainly could. That needs to be investigated. But if it does transpire that it's a Middle Eastern or an Afghan connection, the United States is going to have to think very carefully about how it responds to this. The origins of this attack, of course, are very strong anti-Western and anti-US sentiment within these countries. And by bombing Afghanistan, if it proves to be the responsible for harbouring the person responsible, then the United States is going to really inflame its relations in both the Middle East and in those countries. So there's a lot of hard thinking to be done in the next few days.
All right, Scott, we'll come back and talk to you later. Thank you very much indeed. Thanks for your time in Melbourne.
Thanks, Ray.
All right, as America wakes up and begins to digest the real horror of what happened yesterday, our time, rescue workers must continue the grim task of recovering bodies of victims in New York and hopefully finding some survivors. Working alongside fire, police, ambulance officers and the National Guard are ordinary New Yorkers lending a hand at this most devastating of times. And this report comes from the CBS network. Have a look.
For those inside the World Trade Center, it wasn't just hell on earth. For Bob Fox, it was hell 39 stories up.
It was unbelievable. I was on the 39th floor about 8:45 when a tremendous explosion hit.
Those lucky enough to get out walked out of one danger right into another. A moonscape of ash and debris, smoke and fire, leaking gas, and already the smell of death.
Debris, smoke, all the dust, everything, just couldn't see nothing. And I was praying to God then that, let me get by this now.
Iron worker Tony Cabrera rushed toward the carnage to try and help.
And I seen the second plane hit. And I went into this lobby. And I went into the lobby. I was there with the fire department and everything, and just, it was starting to give away this and that, pieces of people coming down, parts, and whatever.
Never seen anything like it.
Never.
Rescuers were at a loss. Smoke so thick they couldn't see the damage. The clamor of falling debris so loud they couldn't hear the cries for help. All of it made worse when the first of the Twin Towers came tumbling down upon them.
After the first series of explosions, there was hardly time to get in, and those that did were right in line of fire for the next series of explosions.
As the second tower collapsed, Val Coleman had a front row seat to disaster, watching it all unfold out of his apartment window just 5 blocks away.
And a great blossom of flame, a huge red fireball, scared the hell out of me.
Val Coleman was inside the World Trade Center just 15 minutes before the initial attack and remembers the last person he talked with.
A very nice young man answered me very politely. I left, came back here, and boom, he's probably dead.
And as he sat watching the building burn, Coleman could see tiny black specks near the top floors. They were people jumping off instead of being burned alive.
I must have seen 10 or 15 people come down, one after another.
Off the top?
Off what appeared to be the top.
The bombings today brought one horrific scene after another. But rescuers know once they get closer to what's left of the Twin Towers, the images are sure to get worse.
Extraordinary out there. Every time you see those particular shots, you still shake your head. It's hard to believe it. The world's immediate focus, I guess, has been on the incredible human tragedy of these attacks. But the terrorists also were targeting the centre of the world's financial markets, the centre of capitalism, if you like. And they've taken an almighty blow. Hundreds of billions of dollars wiped off the value of stock markets, and a great deal of uncertainty about what might happen next, proving just what a globalised world it is. Every Australian's retirement savings were damaged today. And with me now is Nine's financial editor, Michael Pascoe. Michael, welcome. What happened in Australia basically today?
Basically, we escaped relatively lightly. The stock market dropped 4.1%, which, given the scale of the falls in Europe last night, what was happening in the rest of Asia today, Hong Kong down 9%, Tokyo off 6.6%, wasn't too bad.
Did you breathe a sigh of relief?
Oh, yes. Oh, yes.
You thought it could have been much worse?
And what was coming through, it tended to be retail investors, mums and dads, who were doing the panicking. The big money didn't. The big money was sitting there thinking, well, let's hold off, let's see how the US reacts. The big threat here, of course, is that if this damages US consumer confidence, that means the US goes into recession, the world goes into recession. It's US consumer confidence that has been keeping the world ticking over. Those US consumers have been kept afloat by billions of dollars being poured into the States by foreign investors, European and Japanese investors. Now, if those investors get worried about US confidence, get worried about how safe is the US for my money and pull it out, then we've got a serious problem.
This is why President Bush was saying today that tomorrow we get back to business. The Pentagon opens up and we're open for business down on Wall Street.
That is extremely important. Unfortunately, they're not open tonight down on Wall Street.
Not literally, no. And around the country, Los Angeles, Chicago and so on.
We hope so. I mean, that's something that's been concerning, you know, people who are sitting behind desks here from afar are saying, for God's sakes, get those markets open. There will be big holes in the markets. There will be big firms unable to trade. Get the markets open, show that this terrorism does not stop the world's financial markets, and you could restart that spark of optimism. And there's a good sign tonight in London. London's actually opened up.
Let's go the other side. Let's be a pessimist for a moment. What about if it doesn't restart? Could this be the trigger that puts the world into recession, a serious recession?
Look, it could. It certainly could, because the US has been wavering on the edge of recession for the past few months. A number of problems there that they've been trying to paper over. You've had Alan Greenspan throwing low interest rates at the economy to try to keep it up, to keep consumers spending when business isn't investing. Now, this attack on something as fragile as consumer confidence could be that straw. The US slips into negative growth. You've already got Japan in a serious recession. Europe goes too. We all get caught up in the backwash of that.
How about targeting the World Trade Center? Was it purely symbolic, or given the fact that you've got Morgan Stanley with 12.5% of the buildings, I think there we heard today, Deutsche Bank, Bank of America, lots of stockbrokers. Was it purely symbolic, or have we lost all those records, for example?
No, we haven't lost the records. I mean, any half-competent firm has an off-site IT complete backup. The sorts of firms that can afford the rent in the World Trade Center also can afford to have a full backup.
But they certainly didn't expect something like this, did they?
You don't expect something like this, but you have to work accepting that chaos happens. Each one of those firms, particularly when those buildings have been the target of a terrorist attack before, has to be backed up elsewhere. Major Australian financial firms all backed up elsewhere. Okay. It's just taken for granted as a bit of safe practice.
In a word, what should investors in Australia do tomorrow? Just sit tight?
Sit tight. It's the thing to do at the moment. There were thousands of Australian investors today tried to swap their money out of the overseas parts of their super funds. They weren't allowed to. The super funds managers temporarily froze any swapping around of your funds simply because they couldn't trade it. Because the US was out of action, not trading, they couldn't move that money. The big money in Australia is sitting pat. it's hoping Australia is still a relatively safe rescues.
Okay, I'm comforted when you breathe easily, Michael.
But it's not a sure thing.
All right, thank you again. Of course, the catalyst for this disaster was the hijacking of the 4 commercial airlines. Air traffic controllers were able to follow the planes to their doom. Have a look at this report from the CBS network.
American Flight 11, a Boeing 767, took off first at 7:45 this morning from Boston, bound for Los Angeles. 13 minutes later, another 767, United Flight 175, also left Boston for L.A. At virtually the same moment, United Flight 93, a 757, took off from Newark for San Francisco. And to the south at Washington's Dulles Airport, another 757, American Flight 77, flew off towards Los Angeles. The first sign that anything was wrong was noticed by air traffic controllers, who watched the jets stray from their planned routes. This computerized radar path shows how the first plane, American Airlines Flight 11, climbed out of Boston and, as expected, headed northwest across Massachusetts. But watch what happened. As the plane entered eastern New York, it turned sharply to the south and headed straight for Manhattan. The 767 hit the World Trade Center at 8:48 this morning. And 16 minutes later, United Flight 175 delivered the second blow. The jets, fueled for cross-country flights, were filled with tens of thousands of gallons of volatile fuel. They were literally flying bombs, each with an explosive power far greater than the blast that leveled the Oklahoma City Federal Building. Based on radio communications from the planes, FAA authorities knew they were dealing with a terrorist attack and immediately moved to close New York and Washington airports. And for the first time in U.S. history, all flights across the country were grounded.
The airport's being evacuated. They need to go home.
But there were still 2 hijacked jets in the air, and one of them, American Airlines Flight 77, took aim on the Pentagon. It crashed in a fireball at 9:38. Meanwhile, the 4th plane, the flight from Newark to San Francisco, was heading west, and it traveled all the way into northeastern Ohio. The controllers monitoring radar watched as the jet then did a U-turn and headed back towards the East Coast. At 10:20, 2.5 hours after the 4-pronged attack was launched, the plane crashed in a rural Pennsylvania field.
I happened to hear a plane come through. It sounded like it was running normally. When it come down over top of me, I seen it go nosedive straight into the ground down here.
All right, we now cross live. That was a CBS report. Let's go to the American ABC network for the latest as America wakes up the day after the tragedy.
Again for joining us.
How are you, Diane?
I'm
Yes.
fine.
Thank you.
Thank you. And all over the country this morning, it is being declared war. I'll hold up the New York Daily News here. It's war. U.S. attacked on the New York Times this morning as well. If it is a war for the United States, what is the kind of retaliation that will work? Again, all of us look at the Middle East and we think how often Israel is retaliated and yet terrorism goes on.
Well, we have to have a prevention. Israel alone couldn't have deterred the war because it's global by nature, and we are a small country with limited means to control other places. I think what should be done is to have a scrutiny all over the world and identify those countries or organizations which are hiding, financing, supporting, encouraging terror, and tell them point blank, either you will stop it or you will become a terrorist country organization in the eyes of the world. And I think nobody should be forgiven, no means should be postponed. Like in war, we have to win it with all the legal and reasonable means at our position. The second thing, I think there must be also a spiritual campaign. There must be a call to all the religious leaders, Christians, Muslims, Jewish, to denounce terror. You know, part of those terrorists are getting permission from some clergymen. It's a crime, it's a shame. It goes against the gospel. It goes against all the values which are cherished by all of us. And then we have to look to the financing, to the training. It must be an overall effort with a global dimension, with an American leadership.
Mr. Peres, this is George Stephanopoulos. Good morning. We've seen some reports
Good morning, George.
that say Israel has sealed its land border with Jordan and Egypt. Is that based on any specific threat you've received? And what other kinds of steps has Israel taken this morning to protect its own security?
Well, this morning what happened is there is a town by the name of Jenin that became a center of terror. At least 11 acts of terror were originated from this small place. The army has surrounded the place in order to make sure that no more terrorists or bombs or suicidal bombers will come out of there, and we shall not remain there for a long time.
And you go, Charlie.
Well, Mr. Minister, I'm just curious. So many people in the U.S. government are now pointing to Osama bin Laden as the possible or even likely perpetrator of this, or being largely responsible for it. I'm curious as to what you think we're going to know in a week or a month. What is your theory in all of this, if we find out who is responsible? What do you think we're going to know down the road?
I think you shouldn't look upon it as just a single person or one organization. It's a new dimension. It will be copied. And if you shall not face it determinedly, I mean, you may have it being followed by other countries, by other organizations. The war is today of a global nature, like the economy. We went over from national economies to global economies. Now we're going over from national enemies to global dangers. It cannot be stopped at any point, because even it's bin Laden, some people may try to copy him. And there must be a barrier, there must be a countermeasure, it must be clear that nobody will escape the verdict of this terrible act.
And a quick question to you about a meeting, Mr. Foreign Minister. I know you've been working and talking about meetings with Arafat. Any meetings planned? Yasser Arafat, head of the Palestinians, the PLO.
We were in touch with Arafat, and we told him, look, tonight may be your night. You have to decide to which camp do you belong. To the camp that uses or supports or guides terror, or the camp that stands against it. In a way, if I may say so, it's like giving up smoking. Tonight, you can decide to give up smoking or to go up and burn yourself in the smoke. Arafat must take today a clear decision. The time of twilight, of hesitation, of double language is over. And I think it's a good chance for him too. If he will stop it.
When they can go into the building and start assessing the loss, particularly in human terms, but they've been waiting for the fire to go out, and as you can see, it has not. There have been embers, smoldering embers by
nation's TV screens.
The pictures of airplanes.
And every once in a while, one of them erupts like you've been seeing right now. And you're seeing it. You can see it on the left side of your screen. It has flamed up again. It's quite a little distance away from where the plane actually crashed into the Pentagon yesterday. But before they can really go in there, they're going to have to be assured that there is no danger of fire erupting again. And of course, they're going to have to take a real good look-see with the light of day to see when they can start going through the rubble, when they can begin the grim task of finding out just how many casualties there are inside. There have been estimates into the several hundred, but Pentagon officials have adamantly refused to give any result. They just don't know at this particular point. Right now, it's still in the hands, as you can see, of the firefighters who are trying to put things out. It was about 9:40, I believe, yesterday morning when the plane crashed.
Everyone back on the sidewalk, please.
Were stopped by police.
Fortunately, right now, until we know that it's safe, we're asking everyone to move back.
Now, the people that were evacuated from the World Trade Center, where would they be right now?
Unfortunately, they are all over.
Officer, they're looking for their father, who was in the building.
I understand. Unfortunately, my wife was in the building, and I still haven't heard from my wife. So.
On a cell phone, they call to see if Steve has turned up at one of his other restaurants.
Hi, is Steve there? Steve. Yep, okay.
Does that mean he's gone, or is he still alive?
No, she just hasn't heard from him.
They continue their desperate search, past the rubble, past the screaming rescue vehicles, and then more barricades.
Okay, this is a secure location,
You
so
can't
you
get
can
in.
step aside and walk.
Oh.
It's a yellow light.
A secure location?
How do you feel right now?
I'm scared that my dad, we might not find him. I feel like he's alive. I just want to find him, make sure.
They run into one of their neighbors, who points them toward a police command center several blocks away.
and tell them your situation and that they will escort you to your house.
Yes, yes.
Right there at Pier
yes.
40.
Dan, thank you.
It's another long walk, and at the end, it once again seems fruitless.
And do you know anything about when we'll be able to get in there to get our animals?
There's nothing here.
But then, as Brenda is in the middle of another desperate phone call trying to find her
Good
husband.
to do that. We'll do it then.
What?
We just...
One little happy ending on a day with so much anguish and so much heart.
In the building. I cried the whole way. I saw it coming down.
You don't know.
In New York tonight, the disbelief at today's events goes on. It's early morning now and the extent of the damage is clear. President George W. Bush has vowed revenge once those responsible are found. The ABC's North American correspondent, Craig McMurtry, filed this report from New York.
There was no warning, no heightened state of alert, no preparation for anything like this. A commercial passenger jet slams into one of New York's signature World Trade Center towers. It was in fact following another jet that had gone into the South Tower minutes before, both commuter aircraft hijacked. As startled authorities scramble to close airports and order all flights to land, unbelievably, a third passenger jet slams into the Pentagon in Washington, and a fourth crashes southeast of Pittsburgh. The 4 aircraft carried 266 souls. In downtown Manhattan, chaos. People desperate to escape cling to the side of the crippled skyscrapers until the last.
One at a time from different parts of the building. I just started seeing the people just drop. And I must have counted like 30 or 40 people, you know.
Emergency workers scrambled to evacuate the thousands believed to be trapped inside. And then an image that simply defies words. 110 floors of concrete, steel and glass folding like paper, and a massive suffocating cloud that consumes downtown Manhattan.
Take them right in the kitchen, rinse them down!
Get everybody, yeah, that's a good idea. Both towers are erased.
Can't even look at it. Because all I can see are people. I don't see a building, I see people. People hurt. Children without mothers and fathers tonight.
US leaders evacuated from the White House and Congress acknowledged the deadliest and most coordinated terrorist attack in US history. Like Pearl Harbor, they call it an act of war.
Make no mistake, the United States will hunt down and punish those responsible for these cowardly acts.
Up to 50,000 people are believed to work in the Twin Towers. Hours later, no one, including New York's shocked mayor, has any idea of the likely death toll.
I don't think we yet know the pain that we're going to feel when we find out who we lost.
And it isn't over. Hours later, a third building of 40 stories collapses. Tonight, with much of New York shut down, hospitals are struggling to deal with the injured. There are reports of 78 police and 200 firefighters missing. And as gruesome as it sounds, it could just be the beginning. When the daylight returns, a grisly recovery operation will begin, on a scale never seen before.
Tonight I ask for your prayers for all those who grieve, for the children whose worlds have been shattered, for all whose sense of safety and security has been threatened. And I pray they will be comforted by a power greater than any of us, spoken through the ages in Psalm 23. Even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I fear no evil.
It was the day New York's skyline and America changed forever. September 11, 2001. Craig McMurtry, ABC News, New York.
One of the thorniest questions in the wake of today's carnage is how the massive United States intelligence establishment failed to have any inkling of this devastating attack. London-based Arab journalist Abdel Bari Atwan says he was warned of an impending terrorist attack 3 weeks ago. Here's what he had to say during an interview with CNN late this afternoon.
Tell us a little bit more about this warning. There have been many others, haven't there?
Well, actually, I believe this could be a work of consortium of many organizations, Islamic organizations, which they declared war against the United States. You know, the anti-American feeling is very high now in the Middle East and the Muslim world because what's happening on the occupied territories, and many people accuse the United States of actually helping the Israeli and protecting them. So the groups like Bin Laden and other Islamic fundamentalists, actually, they would like to come out and say, look, you know, we are targeting the United States. The United States is supporting the Muslim and Arab enemies, which is the Israeli, and we are taking revenge of what's happening. So we learn from sources that, you know, they are really at work to hit the American target. But nobody expected that this target will be in New York itself or in the Pentagon. So the place of the attacks was surprising to everybody.
Abdul Bari, Osama bin Laden has been said to be really trying to turn Afghanistan not only into what he would term a pure Islamic state, but into a base where there are people who would support exporting, if you will, his brand of Islamic revolution.
Well, actually, you know, I interviewed Osama bin Laden on Afghanistan in November 1996, and I did see his camps and his followers there. You know, the man is ruthless, and, you know, he believes that he should declare war against the United States. And this kind of appeal, this kind of call actually appealed to many young Muslims all over the world. And he recently managed to recruit a lot of those highly educated Arabs who were even educated in the United States itself and some Western countries. So I'm not surprised if he is surrounded with experts in different fields. And we noticed that the attack against the American destroyer Cole in the seaport of Aden was highly sophisticated attack, highly sophisticated on the bombing, the information gathering, and the monitoring of the movement of the American warships. So I'm not surprised if those highly intelligent people, highly educated people actually were behind the planning of the attacks against the World Trade Center.
You know, when people look at this and they see it in the narrow confines of one day, people saw Palestinians standing up and cheering these attacks in Nablus, in refugee camps in South Lebanon, where they've languished for half a century. When they look at that, on one hand, it creates a sense of anger. And there has to be a sense as well from some among the Arab world that this is not going to lead to an improvement in the situation, and certainly not a change in the U.S. position.
Jim, you are absolutely right, but we have to put into our consideration there are 300 million Arabs, and those people are very few who actually were dancing in the streets, whether in Nablus or in refugee camps in Lebanon. The Palestinians definitely will suffer because of these attacks, because they want the American involvement in the peace process to be revived. And they want the American to be the sponsor of the peace process and to intervene and put an end to the Israeli aggression against their people there. So we cannot say those people representing the Arabs, but, you know, we have to ask our questions, you know, why America is targeted, why the American people are targeted. Definitely there is something wrong with the American foreign policies. So these wrongs has to be readdressed, has to be rectified. And we want more involvement from the United States on the Arab-Israeli conflict to revive the peace process, to put an end to the Israeli atrocities. Also, there are Palestinians killed in the West Bank and Gaza Strip every day by the Israeli tanks, by the Israeli missiles. So we have to understand the frustration of some people, but this doesn't mean that we should support any terrorist acts against innocent Americans in New York and Washington, anywhere in the world. It is a terrorist act. Everybody condemned them.
Do it. We don't yet know what the casualty numbers are for the military. I've been trying to find out. I'm quite sure I know a lot of the people who were injured and perhaps killed there yesterday because they took a lot of the Army wing out. So I don't know enough to know, but I will do whatever I can. I've cleared my schedule, and if I don't do anything but help pick up bricks and give blood, I want to do that. I think that all of us need to do what we can to demonstrate to the world that, first of all, this is a human crisis, and we are grieving with and supporting the families affected. And secondly, we're not going to let it beat us. We're going to rebuild, and we're going to go on, and we're not going to look the other way. And like I said, the country I thought was very well represented, our values, our ideals, and our interests by what the president said last night. I thought it was an excellent statement, and I think all of us should support it.
As Australia's best-selling small...
I didn't think that it would be helpful to him, and so I didn't want to bother him. I just called and expressed my support and left a message because, you know, yesterday they had to, first of all, keep him on those bases until we knew for sure that the attacks, the series of attacks, seemed to be completed. I completely understand that. And then he had a lot of work to do. He had to get that talk together, and you know, these are decisions that he's making, and the rest of us should just do what we can to support the country and the people and the direction that was outlined last night. I think it was the right thing to do, and I'll do what I can to help in any way I can.
Mr. Clinton, can you tell us what sort of contact you had with Senator Clinton?
If the 2 million who die every year were rich, there'd be a better one. If this makes you sick, contact MSF.
This week on Insight, branding the gangs.
There is a problem with recruitment from specific ethnicities of gang membership.
Everything negative is coming from ethnic community.
There always is the danger of stigmatising people.
A lot of people call them hoodlums. They don't care. They walk around calling themselves hoodlums.
8:30 Thursday.
To an SBS News and Current Affairs special on the terror attacks in the United States. Later in the program, I'll speak to terrorism specialists and commentators from around the world. But first, we begin with a recap of the main events.
It's been described as an act of war, an attack on humanity itself, the most audacious assault in the history of terrorism, all the more terrifying because it was played out in front of the eyes of the world. Tonight, nearly 24 hours after the first plane struck, the authorities haven't even begun to count the dead. It's thought at least 800 were killed in the attack on the Pentagon. It's feared thousands, maybe tens of thousands, perished in the World Trade Center.
It was the start of a day the world will never forget. One of the distinctive twin towers of the World Trade Center had been hit by a passenger airliner. Even before this had sunk in, the unbelievable happened.
Another one. Taking a look. Oh my God!
A second hijacked aircraft flew straight into the other tower.
Looking out across beautiful New York Harbor on a cloudless day and seeing this jet.
It was a surreal moment witnessed right around New York.
I was just standing here watching the World Trade Center after the first plane hit. I just saw a second plane come in from the south and hit the south tower halfway between the bottom and the top of the tower. It's got to be a terrorist attack. I can't tell you anything more than that. I saw the plane hit the building.
Those who could were running for their lives. "50,000 people work in the World Trade Center building. Many of them were already at their desks.
A big explosion happened. Some guy came out. His skin was all off. I helped him out. This is him all over. There's people jumping out of windows. I've seen at least 14 people jumping out of windows. It's horrific. I can't believe this is happening.
We heard a big bang, and then we saw smoke coming out, and everybody started running out, and we saw the plane on the other side of the building, and there was smoke everywhere, and people are jumping out the windows. Over there, they're jumping out the windows, I guess because they're trying to save themselves. I don't know. And then we saw the people jumping. We saw what we thought was debris, and we realized it was people jumping.
Then came news of a third strike. The Pentagon in Washington, the very symbol of American invincibility, had been hit by another hijacked airliner. The heart of the United States' proud national defences had gone up in smoke. Here alone, 800 people were dead. And then a fourth hijacked plane came down near Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. It's not known where it was heading, or whether it crashed or was brought down. The president said the nation had seen evil.
Terrorist attacks can shake the foundations of our biggest buildings, but they cannot touch the foundation of America. These acts shatter steel, but they cannot dent the steel of American resolve.
Back, 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 back!
Back in New York, there was more horror to come. As firefighters and ambulances converged on the scene, the World Trade Center collapsed.
Also, would you make everyone aware that we're going to be seeing some tape?
First one tower, then the other. The drama captured during a live television interview.
People were just standing around, talking at each other, nodding their heads. Oh my God. We gotta go. We gotta go. We gotta go. Oh my God. We gotta go. Right, well, sorry, it's going down. It's going down. Don't worry, it's going down. It's going okay from here. But you need to shoot. Sorry, it's not my job.
There was a hole in the sky where the elegant symbols of world trade once towered. And then, like a house of cards, another building came down. It's hard to believe one of the world's best-known skylines has been changed forever. The city that never sleeps is for once strangely quiet.
New York's rescue crews may have thought they'd seen it all, but nothing could have prepared them for this. One of America's proudest icons, reduced to a pile of rubble and human misery. Emergency workers know there are survivors under the mountain of debris. Victims have been calling for help on mobile phones. The problem is how to locate them and save them without causing further injuries. The fact that this disaster came in waves made it all the worse.
Come on in! Thank you.
The evacuation started moments after the first plane strike, but it was far from complete when an hour later the Twin Towers collapsed.
Man, what happened here? Dude, man, the thing's gone. It blew up. I don't know. I came down. I'm alive. I just want to know if my wife wife was alive. I was on 82.
82?
Yeah.
How'd you come down the stairs?
Stairs.
What was that like? Panic?
No, it was calm until I got down. Then the top came down.
Hundreds of police officers and firefighters were caught in the collapse. Some were forced to flee, leaving colleagues inside.
But we stayed because our officer was trapped. We didn't come out of there. We were trying to dig him out. He was alive. And then it collapsed again on us. They're looking for him.
How many people you were able to get out? Do you have any idea?
We don't know. We tried to do a floor-by-floor search. New York City Police, the Fire Department, Port Authority Police, best they could, tried to get everybody out. But as you know, there were people still coming out after that building came down.
Emergency crews had little time to grieve. In the midst of fires, gas leaks and choking smoke, thousands of people emerged, needing urgent attention. Nearby hospitals overflowed. Thousands answered calls to replenish the city's fast-diminishing blood supply. Medics are working through the night. This man haunted by his memory of the collapse.
And the sound was it was like a train rumbling for maybe like 35 seconds. And then it was like this pause, and then boom, hit with all the dust, and it was black. I mean, pitch black. I don't know anybody could have survived being on the street.
In characteristic style, New York's mayor is overseeing the operation from the streets.
It's terrible. I mean, the damage is terrible. People are doing everything that they can to rescue as many people as possible, and this is going to be a long-term effort. So I just wanted to make sure that everything is here that could be here, and it is. So we just pray to God that we can save a few people.
In Washington, too, the cleanup effort continues under lights. Meanwhile, chilling details have emerged about the last moments aboard one of the hijacked flights. 31-year-old Mark Bingham called his mother and aunt from aboard United Airlines Flight 93 just moments before it crashed near Pittsburgh.
He just said, I want to let you all know that I love you very, very much in case I don't see you again.
I said that.
That the plane has been taken over by hijackers. And then I said, well, we love you very much too, Mark. Let me go get your mother.
He said, I want you to know I love you very much, and I'm calling you from the plane. We've been taken over. There are 3 men that say they have a bomb. And I said, well, who are they, Mark? And he repeated that he loved me, and he said, I don't think he said, I don't know who they are. He became distracted there, as if someone was speaking to him, and he said, it's something to the effect of, it's true, and then the phone went dead.
Reports like this are being collected by the FBI as part of its investigation. Another priority is to retrieve the aeroplane's black box recorders from the scenes of the crashes. They may hold vital clues to who was behind these attacks.
And joining us now from Washington is Professor Emilio Viano from the International and Strategic Studies Institute at American University. Professor, thank you very much for joining us tonight. We've just been looking again at these truly devastating pictures. Is there anything that the United States could have done to prevent this?
I think that the major lapse here is in intelligence. Obviously, something went horribly wrong with the intelligence services of the U.S., both the National Security Agency, the CIA, the FBI, and even local law enforcement agencies. This is extremely surprising and troubling, and I'm sure that in the next few days or months, there will be lots of questions, investigations, hearings about this lapse of the intelligence of the U.S. It is a very embarrassing situation for the CIA and the FBI and the NSA in particular.
As I understand it, there was a State Department report in June warning of a possible attack on the United States, which was reissued again 4 days ago. Clearly there was some sense that something was going to happen.
Yes, But obviously that is not good enough, and considering the hundreds of millions of dollars spent on intelligence in this country, there are those who say that we should have gotten better information. Obviously, we had quite a number of people in this country that were working, planning, scheming to carry out these terrorist attacks, and it seems that something should have surfaced that was more precise and more focused. As far as preventing the actual terrorist acts against, let's say, the World Towers in New York or the Pentagon in Washington, that is, of course, much more difficult to do, particularly when civilian airlines belonging to well-known airlines in the U.S. are flying in the skies of New York. That is, of course, much more difficult to prevent in any effective way.
Is it at all possible, do you believe, Professor, to paint a picture of the kind of people that these terrorists were?
Well, from the information that is emerging, we can indeed think that they were quite disciplined, quite well trained, obviously well motivated because they were ready to die, and they had the patience, the training to plan very carefully what they did. There is no question that this was a terrorist attack that required a lot of detail, attention to minutiae, and to quite a good preparation so that they would not attract attention boarding the airplane. They would not trigger any alarms of any sort as they were on the plane initially. So I think that in a sense it shows how vulnerable we all are, regardless of the security precautions that are being taken at airports. I suspect that these terrorists did indeed take these flights before to test the system to see if they could foil the profiling of the potential terrorists that is being used at various airports in the US, and apparently they tested it, they passed, and they felt confident they could carry it out.
Yes, while, as you say, we are talking about very careful planning here, we're not talking, for instance, about people bringing explosives or weapons onto jet aircrafts, are we? So it must have been relatively simple to pass through domestic US airport checks.
Not necessarily, because there are definite profiles and indicators of possible trouble. For example, the person who travels alone doesn't check much luggage, buys the tickets at the last minute, pays cash, and of course belong to certain potential groups from which terrorists are often drawn. So obviously they had to cover all those bases, and they did it apparently quite well, because they were all successful in boarding these airplanes without being spotted, without arising any suspicion. Now you're right, they did not apparently carry any weapons that would be discovered through the normal scanning of luggage and carry-on luggage. Apparently they carried maybe razor blades and other similar instruments disguised as shaving kits. We don't have enough information yet to really know, but this seems to be what they did in this case.
We also presumably know that these were people who were capable of flying these planes.
Yes, absolutely, absolutely. It is clear, of course, that they had trained, that they were, some of them were pilots, and pilots capable of flying the latest version of this airplane. So no doubt this indicates, for instance, that most probably there was state support for this operation. Evidently, these people trained, they had to train somewhere. It is not just so easy to rent a 737 or a 767 and say, I want to learn how to fly. So evidently they had to have access to the airplanes, they had to have access to training, they had to have access to practicing takeoff and landing and operating the aircraft, and these were the latest models, so evidently they were quite up to date. So this was a major operation, and this also might indicate that there was state support from some country, most probably in the Middle East, for what happened here.
And I know this is the big question, but do you have any sense yourself of which particular Middle Eastern country this may have been?
Well, the list is not very long. The first country that comes to mind is, of course, Iraq. The next one possibly could be the Sudan, and then maybe Afghanistan. So the list is not very long. It's not difficult to narrow it down. It is a question of finding some evidence, some links that might lead the U.S. to identify exactly who did it. Obviously, most people think instinctively of Afghanistan because that's where bin Laden is operating. But Iraq could possibly be implicated, and the same even with Sudan. Libya, I don't think would be involved in something like this. At least all the indications are that they have tried to mend their ways and to rejoin as much as possible the international community. But basically those are the countries that we could think of, and probably one of them is indeed involved in all of this.
You are saying that this so far has been a chronic failure of US security and intelligence, rather. How do you think US intelligence will deal with the situation now?
Well, obviously there are many different ways. The easiest one is to say we have been starved of funds, our services have deteriorated, particularly at the ground street level, and therefore give us more money and we will fix it, and next time we will know ahead. That is generally the easiest way to address these issues, give us more money. I think that probably that is simplistic. There are other ways in which these services have to be maybe reformed, revised, improved. Many people for years have been saying that the quality of the CIA information, for example, is often quite poor. We also know that other foreign intelligence services like the Israels, for example, have often felt that the CIA is not as good as it is touted to be. So it will depend on the direction that we are going to go. But there is no question that in the US there will be tremendous push, tremendous pressure on Capitol Hill, in Parliament and in the White House to provide more money for intelligence services that will claim that they have been deteriorating because of lack of funds and neglect, and also, of course, more money for the military in order to be ready to carry out missions of retaliation and defense in cases like this.
Professor, we are running out of time. Just very quickly, there's been a great deal of criticism now of the United States' focus on a national missile defense. Do you think it's going to alter this administration's push for national missile defense?
No, I don't think that it will have any influence. What many of us hope is that it will lead the U.S. to review and possibly revise its policy in a comprehensive way towards the Middle East, and particularly the conflict between the Israelis and the Palestinians. The Bush administration has truly kind of neglected this area. A lot of attention has been focused on Russia, on China, on the nuclear weapons that Russia has, etc., etc. But I think that it is time that we recognize that that region, the Middle East, and particularly the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, is an international threat to the security of the U.S. and many other countries and of the international economy. And so it is time that we really present a more balanced approach and try to find a just and equitable solution for all parties involved.
All right, Professor Viano, we must leave it there, but I appreciate your time this evening.
It was a pleasure. Thank you.
Well, the United States has virtually shut down in the wake of the terrorist attacks. Tens of thousands of airline passengers are stranded, while business, federal offices, schools and sports venues have all closed. And transport and communications are in chaos across the country.
A lone jet fighter flies over the burning Pentagon. The headquarters of US military might, this is a scene that less than 24 hours ago was unimaginable.
It is a tragic day for America. Our thoughts and prayers are with the injured and their families and the casualties. We're taking every appropriate step and precaution to prevent further attacks. We're making every effort to take care of the injured still in the building. and we're taking every appropriate measure to determine who is responsible.
America is now on Delta Alert, the military's highest security level, a war footing, meaning extra guards, restrictions on personnel movement and other precautions.
I will tell you up front, I have no intentions of discussing today what comes next, but make no mistake about it, your armed forces are ready.
One Pentagon official said the aircraft carrier, the USS Enterprise, due to be rotated out of service in the Gulf, had been told to remain in place and await further orders. The authorities have moved to prevent another airborne terrorist attack, shutting airports and emptying America's skies of civilian flights for the first time in history.
We're starting a total evacuation of the airport.
There's massive disruption and fear among travelers and their families.
Terrified. I'm devastated. I'm just shaking. I'm shaking. Every time I call home, I called my niece, she's crying. I called my sister, she's crying. I called her brother, he's crying. I mean, everybody's just hysterical back at home. And this isn't, it's not good. This is a very bad state we're in.
I have ordered the FAA to ground all commercial air traffic until at least tomorrow afternoon. After the attack, some of our aircraft were diverted to Canada. Travelers will indeed see increased security measures at our airports, train stations, and other key sites. There will be higher levels of surveillance, more stringent searches. Airport curbside luggage check-in will no longer be allowed. There will be more security officers and random identification checks.
Other precautions across the US, such as the closure of all federal buildings, have left the streets deserted. This is downtown Los Angeles, normally jammed with traffic. The emergency resources of the world's most powerful nation have been mobilized to help victims of the attacks.
From the moment that we learned of these attacks, the Department of Health and Human Services has begun readying teams and resources to be sent to New York City and the Washington area to meet any needs of state and local officials. So far, we have sent 4 disaster medical teams to New York City and 3 of these disaster medical teams to the Washington, Northern Virginia, Baltimore area. These medical teams each consist of about 35 physicians, nurses, and emergency medical technicians. They are all trained to deal with traumatic injuries and other emergency needs.
Investigators are combing through mobile phone calls for clues. A woman in the hijacked American Airlines plane that was to crash into the Pentagon called her husband on a mobile phone to say the hijackers had forced the passengers to the back of the aircraft at knife point. The hunt is on to find those responsible.
The determination of these terrorists will not deter the determination of the American people. We are survivors, and freedom is a survivor. A free American people will not be intimidated, nor will we be defeated. We will find the people responsible for these cowardly acts, and justice will be done.
They'll also want to discover how the killers, armed with knives, breached airport security so easily. Boston's Logan Airport, where 2 of the planes took off, will come in for particular scrutiny.
World leaders have declared solidarity with the United States, condemning the carnage and vowing to fight terrorism. Iraq stands alone, saying the US got what it deserved. Fingers have been pointed at Afghanistan, but the ruling Taliban has denied any involvement.
As the world reeled in shock, Kabul was under attack, sparking speculation the US had fired missiles at the Afghan capital in retaliation. The obvious target, the world's most wanted terrorist, Osama bin Laden. But opposition forces in Afghanistan claim responsibility. The ruling Taliban's foreign minister said his government did not support terrorism, so there was no reason for reprisal attacks. Palestinian militants celebrated what they saw as a victory over Israel's ally. But reporters on the ground say many Palestinians are now living in fear of massive retaliation, praying the attacks on the US weren't carried out by their militants. Blame initially fell on the Democratic Front for the Liberation of Palestine.
We completely deny our relation to this explosion.
Sheikh Ahmed Yassin, the spiritual leader of the Islamic group Hamas, said they don't support attacks on civilians, but he warned the US to revise its stance. The Palestinian leader Yasser Arafat denounced the attacks.
We are completely shocked, unbelievable.
The Israeli Prime Minister Ariel Sharon said the fight against terror was now very much an international struggle.
I believe that together we can defeat these forces of evil.
The UN, which is now considering pulling its staff out of Afghanistan, has appealed for calm.
Terrorism must be fought resolutely wherever it appears. In such moments, cool and reasoned judgment are more essential than ever.
NATO chiefs met in an extraordinary session to discuss the crisis.
We met this evening specifically to express solidarity with an ally that had been the subject of this kind of terrible, dreadful attack.
Putting its military forces on high alert, Britain imposed drastic security, banning civil flights over London. Prime Minister Tony Blair led a chorus of condemnation from Europe.
This is not a battle between the United States of America and terrorism, but between the free and democratic world and terrorism.
I want to tell Americans, especially the families of the victims, they have the solidarity of the French people, said French President Jacques Chirac. What happened in the United States concerns us all. All Germans are filled with horror, said Chancellor Gerhard Schröder. This is a declaration of war against the entire civilized world. At a mass attended by 2,000 in Berlin, there were tears. Passengers on US-bound flights turned back to Munich were still in shock.
Well, we heard about it when we were in the middle of the Atlantic going home, and it just seemed
like a novel.
Just like a novel. It's just so senseless, and the tragedy of all the loss of life.
As security was tightened around the US Embassy and other American interests in Beijing, China's state media reported that President Jiang Zemin had sent a message of sympathy to President Bush. Immediately establishing an emergency task force in Tokyo, Prime Minister Junichiro Koizumi said Japan would do anything to help the US through the crisis. American military bases in Japan are on maximum alert tonight.
And joining us now, SBS correspondent Dennis Grant from Washington. Dennis, a new day. Is there any discernible shift in the way Americans are dealing with this terrible tragedy?
Jana, I think yesterday was a day of shock. Today's a day of fear and anger. Americans are waking up and perhaps coming to reconcile the full impact of this extraordinary tragedy. Here's how it's being reported. These are the papers fresh off the print. Washington Post talks about hundreds dead. Well, I think that's a little optimistic. Officials here in Washington are talking about thousands dead. The great grey New York Times, all the news that's fit to print. US attacked. That's the kind of language that we're seeing here. The USA Today, America's national paper, uses the W word, act of war. Interestingly enough, yesterday, as Americans were watching their television, the networks were very slow to point the finger, to apportion blame. That's a legacy of the Oklahoma tragedy, when very early in the piece the Americans' networks were describing it as an act of possibly Arab terrorism. Of course, it turned out to be one of their own, Timothy McVeigh. So yesterday, they were rather cautious. Overnight, however, it's quite discernible in the morning TV broadcasts that the finger is now being pointed, particularly to Osama bin Laden, the Saudi billionaire terrorist. They have have essentially, on the basis of sources in the Pentagon and in the administration at the White House, have essentially decided he's the villain of the piece. It was quite an interesting but discernible sea change in media opinion.